Millions of Americans genuinely believe that Donald Trump had finally cracked the code, that he had found the perfect formula to turn the United States into a permanent energy superpower forever. That belief was not naive. It was built on real promises, real deregulation, and a story that made total sense on paper. So here's the question that this entire film is going to answer. If the plan sounded so solid, why did reality turn out to be so different? To understand that gap, we first need to understand what the plan actually was. Trump's energy message was built around a handful of very clear ideas. Cut regulation, expand production of oil, gas, shale, and coal, speed up permitting for pipelines and drilling projects, roll back the climate rules put in place under the previous administration, and wrap all of that inside a phrase that was designed to be repeated on every news channel in the country: energy dominance. The White House argued that removing restrictions on fossil fuels would lower costs for families, create jobs in industrial states, and strengthen America's position as an exporter on the world stage. Now here is why so many people believed it would work. It was not blind faith. It was basic economic logic, the kind you could explain in one sentence at a bar. Produce more energy at home, depend less on foreign suppliers, and protect jobs in oil, gas, coal, and manufacturing. That is an easy story to sell, because it matches how most people think about supply and demand in their own lives. If you make more of something yourself, you assume you need less of it from somebody else, and the price should come down. Federal climate rules were reframed not as safety measures, but as costly barriers standing between American workers and cheaper energy. For a while, the numbers seemed to back this up. American oil and gas production kept climbing year after year, breaking record after record. But this is exactly where the documentary takes its first turn, because the full picture is far more complicated than the headline. According to Reuters, production had already reached record levels under earlier administrations, long before this specific policy package existed, and it kept rising afterward as well. That single fact quietly undermines the simplest version of the story, the one where one president flips a switch and the entire energy system responds on command. So if policy alone did not create the boom, what did? The honest answer involves technology, drilling efficiency, and capital markets, three forces that rarely make it into a campaign speech, but that actually run the American energy machine. Shale extraction methods had become dramatically more efficient over the previous decade. Companies could pull more oil and gas out of the same well, at lower cost, using techniques refined over years of trial and error. Investors were willing to pour billions of dollars into drilling operations because the math worked, not because of any single administration's rhetoric. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly, and it is the true hidden engine behind America's energy numbers. Here is where the story stops being a simple political narrative and becomes something closer to a global thriller. The United States energy story was never a clean plot of one plan succeeding and then suddenly failing. It was shaped by shale growth, by liquefied natural gas and crude oil exports, by decisions made inside OPEC Plus meeting rooms thousands of miles away, by a pandemic that collapsed global demand almost overnight, by a war that reshaped energy flows across Europe and Asia, by inflation, and by rising interest rates. Every one of these forces pushed and pulled on prices and investment far more powerfully than any single domestic policy package ever could. Let's break down exactly how those outside forces overwhelmed the clean logic behind the original slogan. First, OPEC Plus, the alliance of oil-producing nations led by Saudi Arabia and reinforced by Russia, repeatedly adjusted global supply to manage prices, sometimes cutting production to push prices up, sometimes increasing it to protect market share. Those decisions rippled through gas stations in every American state, regardless of what Washington was doing at home. Second, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered sanctions and supply disruptions that completely reshaped energy flows across Europe and Asia, sending shockwaves through global markets that no domestic drilling permit could ever cancel out. Third, China's economic swings mattered just as much. When Chinese demand for oil and industrial materials surged, global prices climbed. When Chinese growth slowed down, demand cooled and margins shrank for producers everywhere, including in the United States. Fourth, inflation and higher interest rates quietly strangled a huge part of the domestic energy expansion story, because energy projects are extremely capital intensive. Drilling a new well, laying a pipeline, or building a liquefied natural gas export terminal requires enormous upfront investment. And when borrowing money becomes more expensive, some of those projects slow down or get canceled entirely, no matter how favorable the regulatory regulatory environment looks on paper. This brings us to the golden fact of this entire documentary, the detail almost nobody talks about clearly enough. Shale production, the backbone of the modern American energy boom, was never purely a creation of deregulation. It was, and still is, driven by the economics of geology, drilling productivity, and export infrastructure. The United States Energy Information Administration's own data emphasizes exactly this point, tracking production, prices, imports, exports, stockpiles, and demand as an interconnected system, not as the output of any single political lever sitting in Washington. In other words, the ground itself, the rock formations, the drilling technology, and the global buyers on the other end of the pipeline mattered more than any executive order. So does that mean the plan achieved nothing at all? No, and this is where the film has to be fair. Some parts of the strategy did work exactly as intended. Trump's approach did help accelerate a more permissive regulatory climate for fossil fuels, and it made export expansion politically and administratively easier to pursue. Reuters reports that liquefied natural gas exports surged after Trump took office, and crude oil exports also rose sharply during his first term. That is not spin, that is measurable, verifiable change, and it represents a genuine policy win for the parts of the plan built around trade and exports. The administration also succeeded at something less visible but very real inside boardrooms across the country, sending a clear signal to industry that Washington would be more welcoming toward drilling, pipeline construction, and fossil fuel development in general. For companies that value lower regulatory friction and faster permitting timelines, that shift in tone was worth real money, because uncertainty is often more expensive to a business than the regulation itself. Now for the other side of the ledger, the part where the simple promises started to crack under pressure. The strategy did not deliver permanently cheap energy. It did not create immunity from global shocks. And it did not produce full energy independence in the everyday sense that most people picture when they hear that phrase. American consumers continued to face real volatility in gasoline and electricity prices because domestic prices remained tightly linked to global oil markets, refinery capacity limits, and sudden shifts in demand, none of which respect national borders. And then there is coal, the industry that was promised the loudest comeback of all. Reuters reports that American coal output only briefly improved before falling to very low levels, reflecting a long-term structural decline rather than something that domestic regulation alone could reverse. The deeper problem here was market substitution. Natural gas had become cheap and abundant, renewable energy costs kept falling year after year, and demand for coal was weakening both at home and abroad. You cannot regulate your way around a competitor that is simply cheaper and cleaner, no matter how favorable the political environment becomes. So who actually won and who actually lost in this story? On the winning side, you had upstream oil and gas producers, liquefied natural gas exporters, pipeline-linked companies, and states with strong fossil fuel sectors, all of whom benefited from a friendlier regulatory climate and rising export volumes. Consumers occasionally benefited too, especially during periods when supply was strong and prices dipped, though those gains were never guaranteed and never permanent, because global markets giveth and global markets taketh away. On the losing side, coal communities absorbed some of the hardest blows, watching a promised revival fail to materialize in any lasting way. Climate-focused investors and environmental advocates lost significant ground as well because the administration rolled back key regulations and withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, a major international climate accord. And perhaps the biggest quiet loser was the general public's expectation of a stable, insulated domestic price environment, an expectation that global market forces simply refuse to honor. This is the point in the documentary where we need to kill some very popular myths, one at a time using nothing but plain facts. Myth number 1, a president controls the price of oil. In reality, oil prices are shaped by a combination of geology, capital investment, technology, global demand, OPEC Plus decisions, geopolitical conflict, refining capacity, transportation infrastructure, inflation, and interest rates, layered on top of each other simultaneously. No single office, no matter how powerful, can pull all of those levers at once. Myth number 2, producing more oil automatically means cheaper energy for everyone. This sounds logical, but oil is traded on a global market, which means American barrels compete and blend with barrels from Saudi Arabia, Russia, and dozens of other producing nations. Producing more domestically increases supply, which can help, but it does not disconnect American prices from what is happening everywhere else on the planet. Myth number 3, energy independence means independence from the world market. This is perhaps the most emotionally satisfying myth and also the most misleading one. The United States can produce enormous quantities of oil and gas and still be exposed to global price shocks because those products are priced, traded, and shipped through a worldwide system. Producing your own supply does not build a wall around your economy. Myth number 4. More American production eliminates the influence of OPEC. Even at record production levels, OPEC Plus still controls a massive share of global supply, and its coordinated decisions to raise or cut output continue to move prices worldwide, including at gas stations in Ohio, Texas, and California. American shale added a powerful new player to the game, but it did not remove the other players from the table. Throughout this story, it matters enormously to separate different types of claims because that is exactly where public confusion usually begins. Some statements are verified facts, like the documented promises of deregulation and pipeline support found in official government materials, or the sharp rise in liquefied natural gas and crude oil exports confirmed by Reuters. Other statements are company or political claims, like the phrase energy dominance itself, which was an administration talking point rather than an independent measurable finding. Some conclusions come from independent analysis, like the argument that technology and market economics, not policy alone, drove the production surge. And some popular claims are simply false or misleading, like the idea that this strategy saved coal in any durable sense, a claim directly contradicted by the production data itself. So here is the honest, complete picture once you strip away the slogans on both sides. Was this a brilliant plan that failed for mysterious reasons? No. Was it an empty promise that accomplished absolutely nothing? Also no. The real story sits in the uncomfortable middle ground that documentaries rarely explore because nuance does not trend as easily as outrage. Parts of the strategy worked exactly as designed, particularly around deregulation and export expansion. Other parts collided head-on with forces no domestic policy could ever fully control, from OPEC Plus boardrooms to war zones thousands of miles from American soil. Here's a question worth sitting with before we close this out. If no single president, no matter how aggressive the deregulation or how bold the rhetoric, can fully control global oil and gas markets, then what should energy policy actually promise voters going forward? Should politicians be more honest about the limits of their own power? Or does the public actually prefer the simpler, more confident version of the story, even when that version does not survive contact with reality? Drop your answer in the comments because this is exactly the kind of debate this channel exists to have. So what is the real lesson buried underneath all of this data, all these charts, and all of these competing headlines? It is not about whether Trump was right or wrong. That framing, the one most media coverage defaults to, misses the actual story completely. The real lesson is that no single president, regardless of party, regardless of ambition, controls the global energy market alone. Even the biggest national policies remain limited by global supply, international demand, geopolitics, technological change, and the coordinated decisions of organizations like OPEC Plus, all of which operate far beyond the reach of any single government office. The energy market is simply bigger than any government. It moves with shale wells in Texas, war rooms in Moscow, factories in Shenzhen, and meeting rooms in Vienna, all at the same time, all pulling in different directions. Understanding that is not a partisan statement, it is simply how the modern energy world actually works. And once you understand that, every headline promising a permanent fix from any politician on any side starts to look a little different. So the next time you fill up your tank, or open an electricity bill, or hear a politician promise cheap and endless energy forever, remember everything we just walked through. Remember OPEC Plus. Remember shale economics. Remember global demand swings. Remember interest rates. Remember the war in Ukraine. And remember that prices in your driveway are connected to decisions made thousands of miles away. Decisions no single president can fully override. To not get caught off guard by what is coming next in this industry, join us here, because the real story of energy is only getting more complicated from here.